leader. So you have two excellent thinkers and speakers on this subject conversing amongst themselves. Just as a quick introduction of Sumant, he's, as I said, chairman of Renew, but he has several other roles which he plays at the industry level. And I now, most recently, as I saw yesterday, Sumant, you've been you're the chair of the board of Rocky Mountain Institute. That's right? Okay, so to that, just join your hands together. Sumant is also an author. He's written a book, Fossil Free, which I suggest you pick up and read, because when I went through it, in practical terms, what is possible, what is not, and especially some of you who are not from India, but want to know about the India decarbonization story and the whole energy, greening of energy story, so to speak. There's no better read than Sumant's book on that. So without further ado, I shouldn't take more time. So Mike, over to you to take the session forward.
Thank you very much, Anish, and I hope you're going to give me the full 30 minutes, given that we're starting late. Sumant, delighted that you could join us today. I met you briefly in New York at New York Climate Week at a really fascinating session at the Indian Consulate in New York City. I've been aware of Renew for many, many years. This morning, I know you weren't with us this morning, we had extensive discussions on the energy transition, on the challenges, the way forward, but I want to start off with you and the Renew story, and it used to be called Renew Power. I have to get used to the new branding. I've worked with renewable energy developers in all parts of the world, and we struggle to get to 1, 2, 3 gigawatts. In a space of 12 years, Renew, today I believe, has 14 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity, which is incredible by any stretch of the imagination. I'd love you to start to share with us what were the key critical factors driving that success, and what are the lessons that people like myself and others in this room who work with renewable energy developers, what can we take from this? Because for me, it's a standout story.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. And look, it's a pleasure to be here and to see a lot of the very familiar faces that have been involved in this whole renewable energy journey in India for the last many years. And I'm sure they have a pretty good understanding already of what the issues are and what needs to be done and so on. But to sort of cast my mind back over this journey over the last 12 years and try to reflect on what are the things that made us successful, I think there were different things at different points in time. One, I think the most important fact I would say is that when I started this company, I had no imagination of what might happen in our sector. I had a general sense that climate change was a very important issue and would become more important as we go forward, and that therefore renewable energy was an important thing to sort of move one's career into. But I think the evolution of the sector, I think, has taken a lot of people by surprise, took me by surprise as well. I think the technology evolution that happened, which caused prices to go down dramatically, I think made the whole renewable energy business commercially a lot more viable in comparison to fossil fuels. So I think that was one big driver. I think the second big driver was the fact that the government of India has always been extremely supportive of renewable energy. Even if you go back all the way to 2008, 2009, policies have always been very favorable towards renewable energy. Of course, in those years, it was a niche sector and sort of trying to carve its own place in the sun, so to say. But I think in 2014, when this government came in, I think this Prime Minister had a very different view of renewable energy and about the whole climate change issue and India's stance within that. And I think, Prime Minister Modi just sort of in some ways changed India's entire position on climate change from being a posture of saying, look, it wasn't our fault, so don't blame us for it and don't expect us to do anything about it. And if you want us to do something about it, then give us $100 billion or whatever amount of dollars every year. From that position to moving it towards saying, you know what, we are going to be a country that will get badly impacted, so we better get our act together and do something about it. And oh, by the way, this is going to become one of the biggest opportunities in the next generation. And therefore, we got to really lean into it. So I think that whole shift that became visible to all of us gradually. It didn't happen all of a sudden that there was some big policy announcement. But I think the first sense that we got of it was in 2014 or 2015 when the target of 175 gigawatts for renewable energy was first announced. And then, of course, it's kept ratcheting up. So I think government policies have been very, very supportive. So I think that has also helped us. So I think that's at the macro level. At the micro level, I think what helped us is that we raised a lot of money very quickly in our evolution. And so therefore, being in the sector and having a relatively deep checkbook was very useful. But I think the other things that I think in some ways did, I think reasonably okay was that execution in India is always incredibly hard. It's just never easy to execute assets on the ground. And I think while we didn't do it perfectly, and we still don't do it perfectly, we perhaps did it better than most other people. And I think that allowed us to develop over time a track record where we could go back to private equity investors and say, look, this is what we promised, this is what we've delivered, and they're not too dissimilar to what we had promised. And so that allowed us to then raise more amounts of capital behind the first amount. And as you know, ours is a capital-intensive sector, so raising a lot of capital was very helpful. The second thing I think that really helped us a lot is that we are not a typical Indian infrastructure company. And I think most people here would understand what that means without my having to spell it out. And I think what that did is it actually allowed us over time to create a reputation and create a certain brand name. And I think that has actually benefited us also in many different ways. And we didn't do it because it would benefit us. We did it because that was part of our value system and we just felt this was the right way to go. So I think all of those factors in some ways helped us.
I'm just going to comment and we'll move on to the next area for discussion then, but the very successful renewable energy companies that I worked with had a very strong engineering, infrastructure, power team, but they also had a very strong finance team, a team that was able to go out into the capital markets. And a point that was made this morning, Sumant, is policy and finance go hand in hand. Good government policy will help you attract investment. Yes, you need the quality team, but I think I will say it's a shining example of getting it right. So I'll come back, if we have time, for a further discussion on the renewable energy industry globally. But I want to pick up a really important theme that has come through in the sessions this morning we've had, and yesterday we had the Innovation Day. I live in a world of decarbonisation, and people talk about net zero, but there is a growing consensus that we do not have the technologies today to reach net zero. And we've had fantastic discussions on the role of circular economy in helping energy transition. We talk about CCUS, direct air capture, but I want to put two questions to you, and they're combined. One, do you agree with the statement that we don't have the full range of technologies today? And we can build as much wind and solar as we like, and we have to, but I believe we're going to need more. But secondly, and it became so evident yesterday, there's an incredible world of innovation emerging, but my view is it's unsupported and we need to do more. So I'd love you to reflect on those two related issues.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that capital is absolutely essential because obviously, building out wind and solar is going to require huge amounts of capital. And to give you a data point, in the heyday of the oil and gas industry, as a globe, we used to invest about $1 trillion in that sector. What is required to invest in renewables over the next several years each year is maybe $3 or $4 trillion a year, right? And so this is a sector that is going to eventually become 3 or 4 times the size of the oil and gas sector, and we all know the kind of the geopolitics that is played out behind just that $1 trillion investment and so on. So capital is very important. I think in terms of whether we have the right technologies or not right now, look, my sense is that there are certain kinds of technologies that are mature. There are others that are evolving and will mature over time as well. There may be newer technologies that will also emerge, and I think this is going to be a continuum. It's not that you will suddenly one day have all the technologies and they'll all be mature and therefore you can all implement them. I think this is going to evolve over time. But I think that we now know how these things evolve. And we've seen what's happened in solar. We are perhaps seeing what's happening on the battery side as well. And it's the same kind of thing that will happen most likely in other sectors as well. So I think as technologies evolve, we have to identify them early, We have to invest behind them. We have to get manufacturers getting into them. We have to get them to scale. And in the beginning, the costs are going to be higher. But I think that's where government policy can be helpful in making sure that we ramp up these new technologies. And I think, therefore, there'll be a wave. There'll be a sort of a rolling wave of these new technologies that will keep coming in. I mean, 2 years ago, who was talking about green hydrogen? Right? Now it's become a very, very big potential solution for a lot of different use cases. So I'm sure 2-3 years later, something else will emerge. Maybe around carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, something like that. Who knows, right?
And you make a really important point, and I'll bring it back to green hydrogen and the connection with government policy. In the European Union, where I reside, together with a number of other people in the audience here, the European Union has recently brought out an auction for effectively a grant of hydrogen to help enable the market. So if we are going to get these new technologies off the ground, that type of government intervention is going to be required. My own personal view, Sumant, is we're going to see a lot more government intervention. We spoke this morning about the impact the Inflation Reduction Act is having, not just on wind and solar, but on all of these new technologies. So the role of government policy in India is, again, a fantastic example of the way it's trying to support this agenda. I want to broaden the discussion because the theme of this is a fossil-free future, and that is not a straightforward thing and a really big challenge as we think about the different ways to do it. Part of my role is not just about working with renewable energy companies. Probably the bigger part today is working in the corporate world, where we talk about net zero, we talk about transition plans, we talk about the implementation of the transition plans. What is actually happening in the market is energy and energy solutions is no longer the preserve of utilities or independent renewable developers like you. The big corporates across all other sectors are talking about energy efficiency, PPAs, green hydrogen. Some of them are talking about e-fuels, fleet electrification. So the whole shift has occurred very much towards the corporate sector. I'd love to get a local perspective. Is that what you're seeing in the Indian market? Do you really see corporates take that next step to really start implementing these energy strategies?
Yeah, well, first of all, you're absolutely right that more and more companies are talking about it. But frankly, the whole change is still very slow. And, if you think about it, and I was reading this data point somewhere, and I'm not 100% sure that it's correct, but I read somewhere that almost 2/3 of carbon emissions come from the corporate sector. And so there is an enormous amount of responsibility and obligation, in fact, on the corporate sector to actually dial down on their emissions. And as I said, in that regard, not enough is being done. And I don't think enough will be done unless and until more pressure is brought to bear. Now, that pressure can be brought to bear in the form of a carbon tax globally, right? Which to me is the most logical thing to happen, actually, right? If people are using a very scarce resource, they should pay for it. But unfortunately, we don't have a carbon tax right now. And it should be a single global tax. It shouldn't be different jurisdictions, you have different levels of it. Because that way you will not have capital going to the most efficient carbon reduction strategy. So you need that, which we don't have. So the second thing is, if you think about it, where we are, is that right now the entire focus is on countries making voluntary pledges, right? And those voluntary pledges are not even adding up to 2 degrees centigrade right now. And these are voluntary. So nobody is even tracking what they're doing in terms of the actual performance. So we're way behind on the pledging, and we're even further behind on the actual doing and the monitoring of where we need to get to. Now, if you look at the corporate sector, there's not even any pledging going on, or there's very, very minimal pledging going on. Nobody is validating. I mean, you have the SBTi, but I think there are very few companies that have actually approached them. So there's no real validation of whatever people are saying, let alone actually monitoring who's doing what. So if you think about it, if you look at the entire sort of protocol that we have for the corporate sector, it's very, very poor. And it's almost non-existent. And yes, there are a few companies that are saying, we'll do this and we'll do that. But these are very, very initial steps if you think about the scale of challenge that confronts us. So I'm a little bit sort of my happiness doesn't matter, but I'm pretty unhappy about the fact that globally there's very little pressure on corporates to do more. And that's really where governments have to step in and just put a lot more pressure. Now in India, to your question, the good news is that corporates have become a lot more alive to this issue. The regulator is also asking for more disclosures. And I presume investors are beginning to put some more pressure as well, although, as you know, the whole ESG sort of pressure is now backing off. But certainly in India, we do see corporates beginning to make the move. And that's a good, positive sort of first set of steps. But there's a huge road that needs to be traversed.
So I'm going to, again, comment. So I'm concerned, but I have to agree with your slightly pessimistic outlook. But there are forces driving corporates. So you mentioned regulation, disclosure, investors. I very much hope, Sumant, that customers and supply chains will drive pressure upwards and downwards. You know, the customers are going to demand greener products and services. Now, maybe I'm being the opposite and being too optimistic, but I'm very much hoping that it's a confluence of different factors will drive corporates. For me, I have to say, the single biggest issue facing corporates, particularly as they look at the energy transition solutions they need to implement, is the cost. So I think we have to figure out a way how to make it easier for corporates. How do they justify to their investment committees and to their boards that this level of expenditure is absolutely necessary to make? Carbon taxes is actually one of the ways we try to justify that when we're in front of boards. So again, I'm going to bring the discussion around a little bit, and corporate decarbonisation, I agree with you, absolutely essential. The other part, if we're going to get to a fossil-free future, is back to your particular journey and the renewable energy industry. And I'm not asking you to talk about Renew. I want you to share a local and a global perspective on something that I am deeply concerned about. And my concern is that the ambition stated by the International Energy Association, by ARENA, even by the COP presidency, is that we're going to treble renewable energy capacity globally, not by 2050, by 2030. Now, many of us in this room live with developers and we work with developers, and I see lots of practical challenges. High interest rates, supply chains, we have the usual grid and permitting issues. There are other newer issues. I mean, I've seen projects being slowed down because of just transition, which is an incredibly important area. Nature and biodiversity is becoming a topical issue for renewable development as well. Do you share my sense of concern that the renewable energy industry needs a bit of assistance again to really get it back on track?
Absolutely it does. There's no question about it. And I think that, to me, the biggest thing is what's happening in the capital markets right now. And you see the valuation of clean tech stocks. It's really sort of fallen dramatically. Most Western companies are trading at 4 or 5 year lows. And that is actually going to inhibit their ability to raise capital, which has been discussed is an absolutely critical, sort of prerequisite for the funding all the growth that we require on the equity side. On the debt side, we have this big meeting going on right now in Marrakesh, where there's MDB reform that is going to be discussed. Whether something comes out of it or not, I am a little bit pessimistic on that, because just knowing the bureaucracies that exist in most of the multilaterals, I really don't see them being able to reform themselves that fast. But at least there's enough capital on the debt side in the institutional markets, once hopefully capital markets settle down. So I think capital certainly is becoming a problem. May resolve itself 3-4 years down the road, but as you said, time is critical. We have only 7 years left or thereabouts. So that's going to be the first problem. The second problem is that unfortunately there's a big disconnect between what countries are pledging at a macro level and what they're actually doing at a micro level. If you look at the US, for example, leaving aside all the political issues, which we will not get into, there's simply just not enough transmission capacity that exists. So even though there's a $3 per kg subsidy under the IRA for green hydrogen, you don't have any interconnect availability to put up any large projects, which is great for India because that means we won't be sort of outcompeted by them in a sense. But it's amazing to me that between the 7 sort of the transmission networks, there's no mechanism for them to talk to each other and create interconnect between them. It boggles my mind, right? So it's those practical issues that governments just, whether state governments, local governments, or national governments just are not able to solve these basic problems. And unless we solve these kinds of issues, including, of course, permitting, and so on, we will not be able to get to these 2030 numbers, unfortunately.
Which is a very serious concern. We do have this thing called the Paris Agreement, and there's interim targets for 2030. Renewables, and trebling renewables is a critical part of that. We heard this morning one of my colleagues, Sharad from Southeast Asia, talking about a plan to integrate the grids across multiple geographies, and then in the US market we can't get the grids to talk to each other. So the word for me is practical. There are lots of practical difficulties, and I'm not sure some of the stakeholders forming policy and thinking about it fully understand the full extent of the issue that we have in front of us today. You mentioned the meeting in Marrakesh involving World Bank and other multilaterals. If I could just zero in on that a little bit. You know, we talk about renewables globally and the need to scale renewables globally, but when we get to emerging markets, we have got very, very serious issues over and above the ones we've spoken about, and you've got things like higher risk, issues about foreign currency, issues about policy certainty and various other things. Do you think, and I know there's a big discussion about reform, but even taking the multilateral banking structure we have today, do you think there's more the multilaterals can do in terms of taking on more risk to help facilitate more private sector investment into energy projects in emerging markets?
Yeah, they must, because, you know, while countries like India may still be able to raise large amounts of capital because of the policy architecture that we have and the size of the market, and countries in the Western world or companies in the Western world might also be able to do the same, we also need countries in Africa, for example, to come in. And even for us, if we are able to somehow find a way to bring down the FX risk, we can bring down our cost of funding and make renewables even more attractive. MDBs have an incredibly important role to play in that. Unfortunately, over the last 10 years that I've been, or 12, 13 years that I've been in this sector, they haven't actually done as much as they perhaps should have. I think that a lot of their capital needs to go into catalyzing more amounts of private capital. And it's not, you know, they don't have really large balance sheets. And if they're just going to use their balance sheets to lend directly, then it's going to lead to a very small actual corpus. I think they also know this, right? But how can they come up with different kinds of innovative products that allows more investments, private investments to catalyze behind them? I think that really is the key question. And I think their issue is that they don't have the mandate at some level to do that. And so therefore, governments have to get together and change the mandate. So it becomes a little bit of a complicated issue. But ultimately, I think it's critical for MDBs to play a bigger role.
And you're absolutely right. I've actually been talking to some of the multilaterals about this. What they tell me is they have the same commercial considerations as private sector investors. Yes, they will take more risk, but not that much more, because they still have to deliver a return. And I think it's ultimately back to the donors who actually provide the funding. And you're absolutely right. The amount of funding they have, would you believe, is only 100 billion. Like, it is nothing. So it's using that to catalyze private sector investment is what's really required. I'm sure I've no idea where we are in time, but there's one or two other topics I do want to cover just very briefly, if I could, Sumant. We've spent the balance of this, or the previous part of this discussion, talking about energy transition and the renewable energy industry. I want to turn to the fossil fuel industry itself. You know, I do feel a bit sorry because everybody's talking about how soon can we get rid of fossil fuels. How do you think, and I know both of us are crystal ball gazing a little bit here, how do you think the fossil fuel industry is reacting to all of this? Are they going to say we will just keep going as normal, or do you think they're really starting to embrace the agenda?
Yeah, you know, of course, I think it's kind of hard, Mike, to generalize the whole fossil fuel industry into one single category. But I think what's happening is that, see, in the beginning, the fossil fuel industry largely ignored the renewable sector. I think their view was this is a small sector, let it do whatever it's doing, doesn't matter, it doesn't impact us, we're much bigger, etc. But I think over the years, renewables and clean energy and the whole clean energy transition now it's here to stay, right? And now there's more and more talk, you know, G20 talks about tripling the target, every country has targets, and there's, you know, so there's a whole different level of, I think, now understanding of the whole transition that needs to happen. And the numbers that are being bandied about are you know, much bigger. And so I think the fossil fuel industry is kind of caught a little bit in a bind as to whether they should fully embrace this change and become part of it and drive their investment dollars into the sector, or whether they should just stay out and keep sort of sniping at the edges and try to delay the inevitable. So I think that is really where they are at right now. I think in the beginning, at least some of the large oil and gas majors decided to get into the sector. But then they realized that this sector is not the same as the oil and gas sector. It's more of a utility type sector. The returns are different. The requirements of expertise are different. And some of the big capabilities of taking risk in oil and gas exploration, managing big geopolitical and strategic issues, that may not be that relevant in this sector. And this is a sector that requires much more faster action. The periodicity or the frequency of action is a lot higher. So it doesn't really play to the natural element. And then, of course, so a few of them have now, as you know, and you know the people we're talking about, have kind of stepped back a little bit, right? And they're saying, you know what, let's stick to the knitting. And I think that's really the change that I see happening now in the large oil and gas companies. And now also what's happened is that there are large oil and gas producing countries that are also getting into the game. And I think that they are now trying to, in some ways, make sure that fossil fuels have a more extended run by coming out with things like carbon capture and storage and direct air capture and saying, you know what, if we can actually suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, then how does it matter if we keep putting more of it out there, because net we're going to get to zero, right? So that's, I think, the logic that they're now trying to pursue, which I don't know technologically whether it works or not. And it's not good enough to look at only a scope 3 carbon emissions. As an oil and gas company, you have to look at your scope 4 as well, which is actually consumers that burn the carbon are also emitting carbon into the atmosphere. Are you capturing that and sucking that out as well? Or are you only sucking out the scope 3 emissions-based carbon? And I think that's really where the conversation seems to have got to. But I can certainly see oil and gas companies are trying to get more into the whole climate change conversation now. With what end, I can't 100% say.
So, completely agree with you. My own personal view is they have to be part of the discussion. They've been centrally involved in the energy industry for the last 150 years. So we have to find a way to involve them more in the energy transition. And you're right, there has been a bit of a step back, but that is a concern, but hopefully we will get past that. Just want to wrap on one final comment from you. I want to go all the way back to Renew, and fantastic story, and congratulations to you and the team. I know it's a big effort. We've spoken about the past, and you've got to 14 gigawatts. What does the future hold for Renew Power? Is it more the same and keep building up capacity?
Yeah, so at one level, that's what they're going to do, because that's also the need of the hour. So we'll keep building out more wind and solar capacity. The country needs it. We have, as a country, we're growing at about 7 or 8% of power demand every year. So you just need more electricity generating capacity. And wind and solar are the cheapest forms, so we need much more of that. So that's something that we'll keep doing, clearly. Of course, now there are a few other things happening. Number one, there's the emergence and evolution of green hydrogen as an opportunity to extend renewable energy into a number of other areas. So we intend to get into that in a big way. But I think, again, that sector also requires government subsidies, government mandates, and so on, to really take off a lot faster. And we're going to look, I think, at becoming a little bit broader of a decarbonization-focused company, where other than adding renewable capacity, we'll also help corporates, just like you're helping them with your advice. We hope to help them with products and services, and truly become a decarbonization partner to corporates and also to the country.
Yeah, it strikes me for renewable corporate or renewable organizations like yourselves that energy efficiency and other parts of the energy management structure in corporates must be a place where you can really help. Sumant, I'd love to spend much more time with you. I'd love to spend some time talking about storage, which is a critical part of all this. I think we're out of time. Just to say thank you so much for your insights. They've been really, really fascinating. And thank you for joining KPMG and Anish and the team today.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me. Thank you.
Mike, and thank you, Mr. Sinha. Incredible conversation, brilliant insights. I really enjoyed it. Mr. Sinha, can I urge you to just wait on the stage for a minute? Mike, can I request you to just hand over the memento?